Hello and welcome everyone to Foley's NDI session, Are You Ransom Ready? We are so very excited to present this interactive tabletop session today with E&Y. We wanted to provide our clients a sample tabletop exercise to provide a real-life example of a ransomware attack. We will explore the various decision points organizations are faced with when dealing with ransomware. We hope this session is informative and provides a practical background for you all to take back to your organizations to further flesh out tabletop exercises. I'm first going to turn it over to Courtney to do some housekeeping.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar entitled, Are You Ransom Ready? Before we get started on today's presentation, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. Questions can be entered via the Q&A widget open on the left-hand side of your screen. We will address questions live at the end of the program, time permitting. If you experience technical difficulties during the presentation, please visit the webcast help guide by clicking on the help button below the presentation window, which is designated with a question mark icon. The recorded version of this presentation will be available on Foley.com within the next few business days. You may download a copy of the presentation slides via the resource list widget on the right-hand side of your screen. Foley will apply for CLE credit after the program in all applicable states. To be eligible for CLE, you will need to be logged into On24 for the full duration and also answer one or more polling questions with a 5-digit course code announced during the program. If you did not supply your CLE information, state and bar number, upon registering, please email it to cdonnelly@foley.com immediately following the program. Please note, those seeking Kansas, New York, and/or New Jersey CLE credit are required to complete an attorney affirmation form in addition to answering the polling questions that will appear during the program. A copy of this form is available via the resource list widget. Include the 5-digit course codes on your completed form and email it to cdonnelly@foley.com immediately following the program. Certificates of attendance will be distributed to eligible participants approximately 8 weeks after the web conference via email. And now I will turn it over to Aaron to begin speaker introductions.
Why, thank you. So again, thank you. So on behalf of Ernst Young and Foley & Lardner, I just want to say thank you again. And thank you for joining us today as we run through this tabletop exercise. So on behalf of Foley and my colleague, Jen Urban, who said hello just a moment ago, and myself, Aaron Tantleff, I just want to say thank you and welcome. And Jen and I are both partners here at Foley & Lardner. Jen is in the Milwaukee office. I am in the Chicago office, to where we're based. And we advise clients on a variety of privacy and security matters. We're in the privacy and security practice group. And we help our clients with a number of compliance matters, a number of incident response, assessments, data protection, conducting tabletops such as this, as well as we run assessments on behalf of the companies themselves, on behalf of insurance carriers, et cetera. We also advise clients going through M&A activities on diligence and investments. And so this is something that is very core to our practice. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ernst Young to introduce themselves real quick before we get started.
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Jamie Tolles. I'm a senior manager in EY Cybersecurity practice, where I focus on threat detection and response and cyber resiliency. I've worked on countless investigations and have learned how attackers get into corporate networks and then ways companies can improve their defenses to better detect and respond to incidents. And co-presenting with me today from Ernst Young is Chris Geary. Chris is a senior manager with EY based in Pittsburgh. He's a leader on our incident readiness program, which includes playbook development and tabletop exercises. Chris joined EY about 2 years ago after retiring from the FBI, where he used to lead investigations for cyber criminal organizations and nation-state threat actors. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Jamie. So to get our mock exercise started today, I'm going to give a brief overview of our agenda for the rest of the session. If you have, at any time you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat function. we'll make sure that we get those answered, most likely towards the end of the program. So we're in our opening session currently. We've obviously completed our introductions. We're going to, after this agenda brief, we're going to do an overview, which will cover what to expect from the exercise, the goals, and what a typical tabletop exercise ground rules are. And before we jump into the mock exercise, we will open it up for any questions as well. Then we're going to jump into the tabletop exercise. We're going to present, the data injects that represent the actions that are occurring during an incident, and we'll walk you through that. And that's going to kind of simulate what a ransomware event would look like for a typical company. And I'll explain a little bit more as I kick off that aspect of the presentation as well. And then finally, we will have our closing session where we'll cover observations and action items, and have a discussion with feedback and next steps that could be taken. And we will finish with closing statements.
All right, well, thank you. So we're talking about tabletop exercises. So what this allows a company to do is to consider sort of different issues and identify different risk scenarios and better prepare a company for an actual threat. This allows a company to evaluate its incident response plan in a controlled environment and enhances an organization's overall cyber response and collective team decision making and process. Part of these exercises are designed to help you look for those unknown unknowns within your organization, within your incident response plan. And this is because the incident response plan serves as your foundation or your blueprint for running your incident response to addressing attacks, allowing a company to better detect them, respond to them, as well as recover from an incident. So exercises such as these that we're going to do here today, certainly if you're doing this yourself within your organization, they would be more tailored to your organization, but obviously we have a large variety of people here today. So we're trying to make it generic that will have relevance to everyone who's listening in. But this will allow you then to, the other thing I should say is that when you start one of these things, you should have an incident response plan in order to run the tabletop off of. Obviously, we're, for the purpose of this exercise, assume that we have one and we're working through it. Obviously, that you would have your own for your organization. But this would allow you to run through that tabletop exercise to review your plan, validate it, review it for errors and lapses, help you highlight areas to be fixed. And so this would be this would be what, again, a version of what you would go through. And obviously, given the short time frame, we're obviously going to be skipping a few steps or shortcutting a few things, but this should give you a pretty good idea for what a tabletop would look like. And then finally, as I always like to say, when you start to run through these tabletops, is that if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. So with that, let's start planning. And I'm going to turn it over to Jamie.
Sure. So we have a few goals for today's session. We want to provide some insight into some of the key decisions that you'll have to make when responding to a ransomware incident. And as as Aaron mentioned, preparation is the best way to prevent failure. And hopefully thinking through this mock scenario today will help make you better prepared for the if or when you may need to respond to a similar event. And going through this exercise, you'll likely identify areas for improvement, especially for your own team around people, process, and technology. And ransomware, it's an event, it's intended to be incredibly disruptive and can impact all aspects of a business. It's a very real scenario. Countless companies have gone through ransomware in the last few years. And so this exercise should raise the overall awareness of a crisis management team and hopefully stakeholders that you can identify in advance. And if you already have a crisis management team and a plan in place, great. But if you don't, hopefully this exercise will encourage you to see the benefit of having a crisis management team and a plan established. And then the final goal today is to practice collaboration and communication during a crisis. It's much easier to talk through something, a mock scenario like this than a real life event. So hopefully you'll be able to see some of the conversations that need to take place and the parties that need to be involved so you can practice the needed discussions now instead of, live for the first time.
And now we're going to talk a little bit about ground rules. It seems silly that you have to talk about ground rules when you're doing a mock exercise, but we have found, over the years of doing them, this is a really important part to communicate to your team before getting started. And so, this would be a great takeaway to make sure that you communicate when you do them back in your own environment. And really, the first one is that everybody should just try not to flip ahead. And sometimes we actually prepare decks where you can't, but really is understanding the facts, assumptions, and constraints presented with the facts as of that time. Sometimes when you do tabletops, you like to jump in, 10 years down the road about what's going to happen. And of course, those questions are good. But unfortunately, when it's unfolding in real life, you only have certain facts and assumptions. So it's really helpful to try to just stick to the facts that you have at that time. Also communicating, this is not a test for your team, and it's not like an exercise where somebody's going to get an A or an F. It really is a no-fault environment. People should be really encouraged to answer and ask questions. There are no wrong answers. In fact, I think the best thing coming out of a tabletop exercise is to really understand your internal political environment of when people want to be involved and when people don't want to be involved. We try to make this scenario as realistic as possible. All of us deal with ransomware, unfortunately, almost on a daily basis. But clearly, if you were going to be doing this to your own organization, you would build in factors that are specific to your environment. In fact, when you're going through, it may be a great idea to take notes as you go through to think about how would we do this differently? Thinking about if certain systems are shut down, what would the financial impact be of those? Shutdowns due to ransomware. And also, try to have fun a bit with this. It's certainly not fun when you're actually dealing with a ransomware attack, but at least if you're practicing and have good team involvement while you're doing the mock scenario, it really does help when the actual day, unfortunately, may arise for your organization. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jamie.
I'm going to take this one, Jennifer. This is Chris. So just to kind of reiterate what Jennifer was saying, right? We see these headlines now almost every day. It's pretty commonplace, and we're probably getting a little numb to it. Hopefully not. However, these attacks continue to get more destructive, more intense, and more impactful. No company is immune to it. We've all seen the different types of industries hit with ransomware, from small businesses to schools to hospitals to governments, to Fortune 100 companies, and even our, critical infrastructure has been targeted. We've highlighted 4 examples of significant ransomware attacks here that you're probably very familiar with. What preparation has your company done that will stop it from being the next headlines? These cyber criminals will continue to evolve, and with our, expanding cyber footprint, how are we going to protect ourselves against these ransomware attacks in the future? It is estimated that there are about 50 billion devices currently connected to the internet, and by 2030, there will be an additional 50 billion Internet of Things devices connected to the internet. With 5G here, everything you can imagine is being connected to the internet right now and broadcasting information. Cyber attacks, like I mentioned, are getting more advanced. And having that larger impact. Attackers are targeting a growing surface area, and their attacks are becoming increasingly more unpredictable. Just some stats that I want to kind of share with you all. According to the 2021 Pohlman Institute research report, ransomware attacks cost around an average of $4.62 million in the response. NPR reported that the United States organizations have suffered over 65,000 ransomware attacks in 2020. And in a recent Forbes report, 560 healthcare organizations have been hit with ransomware attacks in 2020, costing over $20 billion in downtime. EY, we've done a recent survey of around 1,000 C-suite and senior business leaders. And, respondents have seen a clear rise in attacks over the last 12 months. We've seen 3 and 4, roughly around 77% of the respondents this year. They warned that they have seen an increase in the number of disruptive attacks like ransomware over the last 12 months. And by contrast, the year before, it was 59%. So that continues to grow. And I think one other piece that we've seen, 39% of organizations are putting cybersecurity on their board agendas quarterly, up from around 29% in 2020. Right, and I think, the threat actors, they've hit a new level of maturity. They're always evolving. The hackers who shut down the major fuel distributor in 2021 used ransomware as a service that others can attain via the dark web, right, posing risks to, other critical organizations throughout our economy and society overall. Ransomware as a service, it's easy. You don't have to have a lot of skills. You just have to be able to make the right contacts to be able to do it. And they advertise out for individuals who have access to organizations to come to them, and they'll split the ransom. And at the same time, we have individuals who've infiltrated an IT software management company over several months in 2020. They did a sophisticated supply chain attack that was, largely unfamiliar to most security teams. So these ransomware and significant events are continuing to happen, and working with the your teams and through exercising through these tabletop exercises are a great way to prepare. An ounce of preparation is worth more than a pound of response. Now we'll pass it over.
So with that, I'm going to little bit of quick housekeeping. So first, if there's any questions at all at any time, feel free to submit them now. As Chris mentioned, feel free to submit them throughout the presentation. What I do want to mention is that this presentation will be a little bit interactive, and that we're going to have polling questions at various parts throughout this presentation, where we're going to ask the audience. So please feel free to follow the instructions on the screen. You'll use that to respond. So we'll try and get a feel for what the audience thinks, what we should be doing on the next step, and some thoughts as to allow us to sort of share, some responses to those things that, what everyone's thinking. Remember, there are, as with anything else, there are no right answers. Certainly there may be a wrong answer or two, but there's certainly no right answers. And if the goal of going through a tabletop is to get to the right answer, you're not going through a tabletop the correct way. It's to learn the process and to figure out what's going on. So with that, but feel free, if depending on the questions that come in, we'll try and sprinkle them in throughout the presentation if we can. If not, we'll answer them at the end. And depending on the number of questions, if we run out of time, we'll certainly follow up with you guys as well. So with that, we'll go into the next slide. So we're going to now actually begin our tabletop. This first slide, not much to talk about here, but we're just going to set the scene. No polling questions here, but after here, it's anyone's guess what's going to happen. So when we begin it, it's a typical Friday morning at, in this case, ABC Company. We're trying to keep it neutral. We don't want to, anyone to feel uncomfortable that we're targeting anyone. It's a typical ABC Company. It is business as usual on a Friday morning. Everyone is coming in to work. Your IT department's got their Hawaiian shirts on a Friday, and we are good to go. So for the purpose of this exercise, we're going to assume that this is going to cover, as we say, a 4-day period. And the timelines, we put some timing on here just so we have some data points. But this does not mean that all, obviously, exercises will occur in this way. And so, but with that, I am now going to turn it over.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Aaron. So just to kind of put out a couple pieces here. The date and time on the top are there for indicative purposes only. It's just to show that the incident is evolving over time. And as we go through this, as Aaron mentioned, there's going to be a set of questions that appear down at the bottom of this slide, and then any of the polling questions will appear on a separate slide, which will come right after this. So we'll have 2 sets of questions. Some of them you can, if you want to reply back into the chat channel, the polling questions, we'll be able to collect that information as we move forward. So for day 1, Friday morning, 9 a.m., ABC Company Help Desk receives calls from an employee reporting failure to access the policy center, which could be any critical information system within the organization. The call transcript. Hi, I am unable to access any of the account data within system XYZ. I'm also seeing that strange message on my screen and can't access my files. Just sent you a screenshot of the message. Please advise ASAP. The message basically contains that your files are encrypted and currently unavailable. $15 million US in Bitcoin to be paid within a week for the decryption keys. And after a week, the amount will increase to $30 million in Bitcoin. This is pretty much the start of a really bad Friday. In your organization, do you have a standard process on how this information gets reported? And how would your help desk, security operations, or incident response teams begin to assess the impact? And I think here, one of the things that we typically point out in tabletop exercises are, is it well known on where individuals should report this type of incident information? Typically, it might be to their manager. It might be to the help desk. Ultimately, we want it to get to the incident response team or the cyber crisis response team, and so they can, start the incident response process and moving forward. Okay. So the first polling question: who would be notified? And we could even, tailor that to be who should be notified as a part of this incident. We will give you all about a minute to respond. We have about 50% completed. Give it about another 20 seconds. Okay, if we can try to get the last few answers submitted, then we'll be able to kind of go over the results. Okay, we're right around 75%. Last 10 seconds to be able to get the answers in.
I'll just chime in and say this is usually when we get lots of phone calls and people saying, so we're supposed to call someone, we have a plan, but do you know who that is?
Okay, exactly, yeah. And then really the idea here is for general awareness for the organization of know how to report incidents. We had 75%, but roughly around 75% said the data breach incident response team. We want to ultimately get that information to them so that they can utilize their tools and techniques in whether they need to do with, mitigating the threat and, if they have to segregate off part of the network to stop it from spreading. The IT service desk at 22%. A lot of times that is the first person that will get called in a lot of organizations. And that is their process of collecting that data that starts the incident response ticket, maybe through ServiceNow, and provides that official notification that there is a potential event that might escalate into an incident. A manager, it's a if someone's not aware, reaching out to the manager, not a bad idea. I think letting the manager know could help others in the department or the area understand that there's a cyber threat, and the manager would be able to report it as well. Police department, ultimately, glad to see no one said that would be the first one that they would call. There is a place for police and or FBI Secret Service in incident response, and we'll cover that a little bit later. But it would not be in this early stage. It would be a little bit later once there's an incident that is confirmed. Law enforcement has a lot of information sometimes on the threat actors and the indicators of compromise, so they can be a huge help to your incident response team moving forward. Okay, excellent. Excellent work on the first polling question. Thank you.
I'm just going to throw in one real brief comment, which is sort of like in the lessons learned sort of category. But, interesting on that last slide, you had such a small percentage saying manager, but doing a lot of the incidents themselves, as you probably realize, that a lot of people actually complained that they didn't know about or how to contact their incident response, their data breach group or incident response group, and actually go through the manager, and it usually goes through several chains. So we actually, interestingly enough, see a very low response on that here, But we see actually in the wild, to say the least, a lot more people going to their manager because they don't know how to do that. So one of the things, my takeaway from that is just great audience in terms of knowledgeable here, but it's a lesson learned that I always say, you need to go back to the organization and make sure the employees understand that and get that training to know where to go.
Yeah, and also somebody, brought up, CISO, your Chief Information Security Officer. That's always a good route. Obviously, that's their main job. So if you know who your Chief Information Security Officer is, that's also a very good option. So moving on to the next inject. So still day one, but Friday afternoon at 12 p.m. ABC Company Help Desk receives calls from other employees reporting the same issue. At least 35 employees across different departments contact ABC Company's help desk and report the same encryption messages and inability to access system XYZ and files on their computers. The full scope of the potential attack is still unknown at this time. So now we're going to go through some other typical questions that happen, right about this time period. The first question is always, what communications are you going to send to employees or help desk callers? And I think the first note should be is that any sort of communication that you provide could very easily get leaked outside the organization, whether that's to your customers, whether that's to the media. Oftentimes we see in newspaper reports, oh no, somebody's got an IT, interruption. Are they under ransomware attack? That is something that we recommend to organizations to have an idea of what you would communicate about. It may not be specifically what you will communicate, but at least some sort of discussion here about what parties and whom in the organization would make that call. Maybe it's something is preset as we're experiencing an IT interruption. We will follow up with details shortly. It could be as short as that, or it could be more customized. But the important part is who in a crisis is going to make that decision? Because again, it could be leaked to third parties. Also at this time, really in the background, in particular, the incident response team and the IT team is really trying to figure out what is the immediate impact on the company and working with business leaders to say what part of our business operations are shut down or could be impacted, and what should we do here? Should we go offline? Should we move to data backups or other things? So you're really trying to assess where do we think this is going to try to predict, how best to handle the incident. Now we're going to do another polling question, and we would just want to ask, who should be part of the cyber crisis response team? And so we're going to poll here on the next slide. Would that be your Chief Information Security Officer, CISO, your legal counsel, your public relations communication department, whether that's internal and external, same thing with legal counsel, your human resources department, your IT team, and if so, who on your IT team, other security functions, that could be physical security as well. What about your CFO or another financial representative, or all of the above? So if you could please enter your responses, that would be great. And this is also, something that all organizations, when you're developing your incident response plan and setting forth your team, are things that you need to consider. Not every organization we deal with has the same set of members that are on the incident response team. It also should be linked to how does your incident response plan ultimately connect into your crisis management plan? Many organizations have many different types of crises, and how does your IR team and your response team here differ than your crisis management team? And how do you report in potentially to your crisis management team? So we've got about 73% of attendees. So I'm going to go and read the results. Thank you all very much. So some of our results here, we have all of the above. You all are very smart because it takes a village. And that, really is the essence of doing these tabletops, is figuring out who in your organization needs to come to the table. And oftentimes it's not just certain individuals, but it's groups of people and their designees. We were laughing before we started here. We were going to do our backgrounds that we're all on the beach, because unfortunately these things happen when people are on vacations, off hours. So it's not just designating, specific members, it's also their designees. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jenny.
Great. Now, I want to make a point out of this incident starting on a Friday. This, in my experience, a lot of incidents do start on Fridays, especially around 5 o'clock, and almost never start on a Monday, especially Monday morning. And it's just the nature of our business. And, hackers know, who they're targeting. They know that, people might have fewer people working, towards the end of the day, holidays, and that's, where they tend to target. So just, keep that in the back of your mind. So this, Friday was, picked, we purposely picked Friday for this example here. And with that said, going back to our scenario, this CCRT team was able to perform a preliminary assessment to determine impact. And, it's not very good. So the ransomware has impacted almost all the company's critical applications, and backups appear to have been encrypted as well. And I noticed there's a question in the Q&A, if it's only one computer impacted, do you treat it differently than 30? And in my experience, it very rarely is just one computer impacted. It almost always is, a significant portion of the computers in the company, whether it's workstations, servers. The attackers are trying to inflict as much pain as possible to get you to pay the ransom, which is their ultimate end goal. And so they're usually pretty good at least encrypting several computers. And when they do this, they will try to they have different deployment mechanisms, but they will try to target as many systems on a network. Sometimes this will be an entire plant at a company. It really depends on how your company's network is set up, whether it's very distributed and siloed or very flat, which unfortunately that's how a lot of corporate networks are, very flat, meaning that several systems are on the same network, which has its pros and cons, but for an attacker that can help them distribute things a lot more easily. A couple key questions here. Who's coordinating the response effort? Hopefully you have some kind of ransomware playbook, and when this has been kind of designated, you might have an incident responder, an incident commander. You might have, several key people from your incident response team with one person kind of designated as, coordinating efforts. It's really critical to have somebody to kind of run point and kind of quarterback the whole incident. Will external entities be engaged? This is another, important question, especially, early on. You want to figure out, are we in over our heads? Do we need external help? You're very likely going to want to engage external counsel first, or very early on, because that can, impact a lot of other things and help give you some benefits as well, where, protecting, things under attorney-client work product doctrine and getting that special, privileged advice from your attorneys, which we'll hear about more here shortly. You might need an incident response vendor to assist, which, there's special considerations as well in, actually engaging that help. You might need a PR firm. You might want to engage with law enforcement. So there are a lot of, potential external entities to be engaged. And then what possible options are available for quick recovery to resume business operations? And that's going to be our polling question on this next slide. So option 1 is recover from backups. Option 2, obtain a ransomware decryptor from a third party. This would be, maybe there's a publicly available decryptor, so you might be able to get this decryptor without paying for it. Utilize alternative systems. This would be, pencil and paper. This would be fax machines. Some alternative options, at least until you can recover your operations. And then the final option is pay the demanded ransom. So we'll just pause here as you think over, what possible options, or what would be, your best option to resume business operations ideally. And then while you guys go through and answer this question, I see there's another question. In the absence of a system, basically your systems are frozen, how do you communicate with employees? Good question. Some companies will have basically an emergency communication method and they can communicate with employees through that method. Normally, they'll send a text message. Like I think my company uses EventBridge, but there are several options out there for kind of emergency communications to basically communicate with employees that there's a severe security incident and things like that. So very good question.
And just to add on that additional communication platform is typically out of band, so it's not on your network and doesn't go through the network. So in case there is an incident that does take the network offline, you're still able to communicate through that out of band platform.
Great, excellent. No, thanks, Chris, for mentioning that. And another thing to mention too is the incident response team should already have a pre-designated out of band communication method in place and set up, and they test it out periodically, because your email's going to be down, your Microsoft Teams is going to be down. You're going to need some out of band communication already in place. And Aaron, did you have something else you want to mention there?
Yeah, I just wanted to just chime in with that. Remember, when you have that out of band communication, think about your document retention, your obligations, and whether or not you need to maintain. That needs to be some type of repository for that information, whether it should or it shouldn't. Who is on that trail? Thinking about attorney-client privilege issues. We have a lot, there's a lot more commentary on that, but it's not just having a second means of communication that the whole company can use. There are specific reasons, and you may want to have multiple channels, things like your IT, security, legal. Which ones come together, which ones are separate trails, PR, and all that other fun stuff. But that's another discussion to have throughout the presentation. But it's not, we want to make sure that when you have those communications, you consider all the other legal obligations that the company may have as well.
Excellent point. Just another, little bit of time to answer this one. I see there's another question around insurance, cyber insurance. It can be a lifesaver if you do have cyber insurance. And if it's a significant event such as ransomware, like we're describing here, it's probably a very good idea to contact your cyber insurer, and that'd be one of your early calls, because they may have specific requirements. They may have certain vendors you need to work with, certain law firms, certain PR firms, certain incident response vendors, certain vendors to actually contact customers if customers are affected by the ransomware at all, or maybe some data, but sensitive data that's also part of this ransom event. So very good question. Okay, so we're going to see what the polling results are for this one. Good. Recover from backups is number one. If you have the backups, you can utilize them. Great. That's the best possible scenario. The last thing you want to do is have to pay the ransom. If you can also, close behind recover from backup is if there's a free decryptor available. I'd say it's a low chance, but I have had cases where we've either been there's a weakness in the encryption algorithm. This is more early on in the ransomware days, where there were decryptors that were available through various vendors or FBI that were able to decrypt the data. There have also been some ransomware groups that have just released free decryptors. They decided that they're going to retire from the ransomware business, supposedly, and release this for the public good. So I've seen that in a small amount of cases. Using alternative systems, this can be more of like a temporary solution where you have to break up a fax machine if you still have one, and some of the other methods that might not be as modern, but also might not be affected by the active incident. And then the ransom, that's obviously a decision that you have to figure out if you do pay it or not. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more coming up. And with that, I'll switch to the next slide.
All right. Well, thank you. So I'm going to quickly just get a few. Get a few quick questions out that are here. One of them is it was out of bound or out of band. I think it's out of band communications. And then going with the insurance. So one of the things about these tabletops is that it helps to figure out where along the process you engage in a certain activity. Certain things we put in this presentation, we put in different orders to elicit a conversation. You'll see that happening in another slide or two. So some of these things, these happen in different orders on purpose here, just to for that purpose of raising a question or raising an issue. But with insurance, though, one of the things we find that when you do these tabletops with companies, they do find that there is a time in which they do need to contact. And depending on the type of insurance. Some are reimbursement, some require notification, some require notification within 24 hours, 48 hours. Some of them require notification prior to, at the time of seeking a reimbursement. So you have to really look at your policy and understand what the requirements are in there. Some policies are pure reimbursement, and some actually require or provide things like assistance, like forensic or vendors, legal, notification providers, and a number of other things. So I always suggest in the very beginning, whenever I know Jen and I get on the phone with a client, the very first thing we ask a client is, well, maybe not the very first, but very, very, right in the top of the list of questions is, do you have cyber insurance? If so, can we see a copy of that? Do you know? So we do figure out whether or not how that works and when they have to provide that notification to them. With that, we're going to go back to our program over here. So we're now day 2, Saturday morning at 8 a.m. And the threat actor contacts the company, demands additional ransom. So they've already applied the initial ransom. So now they're saying they updated the ransom note. Now it says that they want to inform the company that in addition to encrypting ABC company's data, they've also stolen 5 terabytes of sensitive data, and that they plan to release if the ransom amount is not received for the decryption key to return the data. Then the threat actor shares a sample of the stolen data with the company, confirming that the exfiltration has happened and highlighting the presence of employee personally identifiable information and confidential policyholder information. The updated ransom and extortion conditions includes 2 demands: $15 million in Bitcoin within a week, and then after a week has elapsed, if the ransom has not been paid, it's going to increase to $30 million. And then there's an additional $5 million in Bitcoin, which must be paid within 2 weeks to prevent the publication of sensitive information online. So I'm going to say, I'm not going to do a poll question on this one. I'm just going to sort of walk through some of these issues. So I'm going to put the questions up here on the slide ahead of time. But so understand a couple of these things are designed to elicit certain behavior on behalf of the threat actor. One other side note I just want to bring up is that, as you see throughout the presentation, we refer to this as a threat actor. You may also hear some other things, attacker, hacker, et cetera. There are reasons why we use certain terms. And in this case, we're using threat actor throughout the presentation. And we often use that, in a lot of the incident responses, because a threat actor is a neutral term. It generally refers to, it could refer, as opposed to something like an attacker or a hacker. So it neutralizes the term and avoids the issue of identifying this as an individual, a group, of knowing their motivations, et cetera, criminal or otherwise. And it covers sort of all forms of risk. This can be important because as you draft things, that if there's litigation or something or a third party is involved, they often wonder, are there multiple groups? What do they ask questions, criminal intent, is this someone trying to steal? Is it an insider threat? Is it an advanced persistent threat, some type of nation state spy or industrial spy? Is it, is it an individual? Is it a script kiddie, someone who's just using a program? Is it a hacktivist? So right now we don't know any of these things. And so we refer as a threat actor because we don't have any more information to go on. So the next question is, how would you engage with a threat actor? Well, and the question is, would you engage? So depending on, in this particular case, we've got someone who has information, who has, one of the things they're designing to do by telling you that they're going to increase the ransom if you don't pay it is trying to get you on edge, trying to get you a little scared, trying to get you to, off your toes and thinking that you have to make rash decisions. The interesting thing is that, in a lot of these situations, even though there's a time, in terms of when if you pay, what the amount is. So for those who are paying, even if those who are not, the issue is, once you have that engagement, sort of the clock sort of stops a little bit in terms of, increasing, fees and things like that. Again, every incident is different, but what we often recommend is that the company never engages directly. Because first of all, we don't know that when you engage, what happens if, they throw additional malware in there or something else through that communication channel. Sometimes they give you a channel on the dark web to connect to some type of email, some type of other communications. And so they may, send you over malware. And so they may, cause additional harm to the organization. You're also generally not trained, let's say, how to handle negotiations with malware. With criminals, there's a number of steps you want to go through the process. But also, another thing is that we like to use third parties, independent third parties who have an understanding of how to do this, because one, it sort of depersonalizes this. It's they're able to have a conversation. They've trained on this. They've been doing this thousands or hundreds of times. They're able to decipher and tell you, take the fact from the fiction. They also, we here at Foley, the folks at EY and other organizations, we have, databases and libraries of these conversations, of these threat actors. So we all start to understand, we have a history and compare the information between this incident and the last incident. So one of the questions on here is, how do you verify the threat actor's identity and claims? Well, one, obviously, is the data that they posted. But the other is we compare information from companies who claim to be, or somebody who's making a claim to represent a certain organization. And we can look at in the past, if we have a pretty good profile of that threat actor from the past, we can look at it in the future and see, does this one match up? Well, we've had that before, where we've called out imposter. And the problem with an imposter, even if they have your information, is that it doesn't stop the real threat actor or somebody else from coming in as well and asking if you a second hit, a third hit, or even, we talk sometimes about an honor amongst thieves, that, they understand the bargain here. But, if it's an imposter, they may not play by the same rules and continue to hit you. But that's so we look at that, we utilize that information, we work with law enforcement, depending on the situation, we work with the negotiators, we work with the forensics companies, the EYs of the world, to look at the historical information and compare it, and to see, is this an organization that, if the company's electing or considering to go and pay, whether or not this would be one that, we would, that would honor that deal. The other things to consider about when you're discussing, whether or not you're going to pay, is what's the cost of their asking, in terms of the ransom? How does that compare to your business decision? What would it cost the company in terms of downtime from the business, cost of recovery, cost of rebuilding, cost of bringing in third-party IT or whatever else it may be, lost sales, the website being down? What's the cost to the business in dollars and the time, versus what's the cost to the business if you were to pay and get the decryptor key? One thing that most companies, when we go through this process, don't truly understand is that even when you get that decryptor key, understand it is not you put the key in and all of a sudden all your systems come back online. Remember that your systems were now infected with malware, and it was a very rapidly run encryptor, so it's a destructive encryptor. So when you get your data back, it takes a long time to decrypt, and it's not clean data, and you have to go through and make sure you sort through that, especially when you're talking things like financial systems, et cetera. It could have a problem on the company. You have to think of, and we'll talk about later, things like auditing and third parties and, and your financials. So what's the impact to the organization? But sometimes, there are reasons in which to pay. You may have no other choice. And others, it may be that it makes sense not to. But then you also have to think about, what's the publication issue? So part of the problem also is that, there may be data that they publish, and you have to consider the risk of that data being published. But some companies also think that if we pay and they don't publish the data, that, no one's going to know. And you have to also consider your obligations under data breach, protection laws, under the US, under GDPR, or other laws that may exist, and obligations even under contract to third parties, whether or not you have to give notification that their information has been put at risk, or whether it has been actually compromised, even if that information is not publicized. So again, we also, well, with that, there's several other considerations, with respect to before you decide to pay or not pay. And for that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Jen, who's going to talk a little bit about some of the other legal obligations that you must consider before you go down that path if you're going to pay. Jen?
Thank you, Aaron. And right before we get started, it's time for our CLE code. I think, Courtney, you're going to announce that?
Yes. Thank you. At this time, I will announce the CLE code. For those seeking CLE credit today, please type the following into the box on your screen and hit the submit button. LI2HU. Repeating it, L as in the name Larry, I as in the word ice cream, the number 2, H as in the word heart, U as in the word understood. One more time, LI2HU. you. And now I will hand it over to Jen.
Thank you so much. So again, back on the issue of to pay or not to pay, that is always the question that I think you initially have to get some sort of understanding of where your organization, from an ethical perspective, really sits on this. I will tell you that most organizations do not want to pay, and specifically may have guidelines that you're not going to pay. Unfortunately, when your systems are shut down for many days, we see organizations changing their mind and then want to pay. And unfortunately, that is just a reality of the situation. So with that said, we want to bring in and have a discussion about what we call Offect. There is an Offect sanctions rule that is out there that specifically says if you are subject to U.S. jurisdiction, you are generally prohibited from engaging in transactions, including ransomware payments, with sanctioned countries or parties. And this is pretty broad. I'm not going to go through all these in the list, but if you're a U.S. citizen, entity incorporated in the U.S., et cetera, you are subject to these Offect sanction rules. And so what are they? Because they need to come into play because there is civil and criminal liabilities that we'll go through, but you do need to consider these Offect rules before you make a payment. So the sanctions can be complex. There are just certain comprehensive and government-based sanctions against certain countries, as you would guess, such as North Korea, Syria, Ukraine, et cetera. But there's also list-based sanctions that are updated periodically. And you can Google and look up, Offect actually releases lists of those. So when we're going through the process, we look at these lists to try to identify if your threat actor, which we may or may not know who they are, but if we have any sort of indication based on, based on the type of threat, the type of ransomware attack, et cetera, we start to figure out, are they listed on any of sort of these Offect list? Now, here's the thing. With regard to this, many organizations, your outside Bitcoin provider and your ransomware negotiator, as Aaron mentioned, we highly recommend using a third party that's experienced in this space. Not only do they handle the negotiations day by day, they also will run an Offect preliminary search for you, which cyber insurance carriers, often before they will agree to reimburse you for a ransomware payment, they require at least that preliminary Offect search from your outside third-party ransomware negotiator. Also, a lot of outside ransomware negotiators can issue Bitcoin, and many of them are regulated by FinCEN. So most organizations don't have Bitcoin on hand. So for all of these reasons, you want to work with an outside negotiator. They will do this Offect preliminary search. It's pretty short. Many organizations ask us, please also provide some sort of legal memorandum here because of the civil and criminal penalties. We have a, team here at Foley, members that are former Department of Treasury that help in this scenario. But really, we're trying to build an argument around that you should not be subject to any sort of civil penalties because you didn't know or should have known that this would rise to a ransomware payment to somebody in a sanctioned country or on a list. In fact, the penalties can be up to twice the value of the ransom payment, so you have to be very careful. There's also criminal penalties. And again, these memos really provide protection to officers and directors that are making these decisions. Nobody wants to make a decision to pay a threat actor, especially in the millions of dollars. So looping back again to what Aaron said, all of that is correct. Sometimes we know who that threat actor is very quickly by indicators of compromise, or by the type of attack, or we've reached out to law enforcement and they've helped us identify who it is. But truly often, we don't know who those threat actors are until we actually are ready to pay and we get their cryptocurrency wallet. So everybody in the organization could be all on board, ready to pay, and until you get that cryptocurrency wallet, we may not be able to make an ultimate decision. We just wanted to flush this out here. The Offect rules are still relatively new. But there are potential restraints from paying a threat actor. If you do find that the threat actor is on this sanction list, we highly recommend working together with us and law enforcement to try to figure out the best next steps. about how to get back up to operations. It depends on your organization. If you're providing critical infrastructure or others, perhaps there could be ways in which we could do workarounds here. But at this point, if you know that the threat actor is definitely on a sanction list, most importantly, we would work through law enforcement. So when in doubt, get help.
Perfect. Thank you, Jennifer. And so we move back into the incident, and it is day 2, Saturday afternoon, 1 p.m. In order to apply pressure on your company, the threat actor publicly releases a sample of stolen data on their blog. Bleeping Computer writes an article about what's known about the incident. Due to the release of confidential customer information, the incident is shared widely on Twitter and now becoming a trending topic. Customers become concerned about the impact of the incident and could have on their dealings with the organization. So it might create some calls into the call center, and it will start to ramp up on customers, third parties, other partnerships that you might have, starting to wonder what's going on in the organization and how is this going to impact the business. So looking at some questions to kind of consider, have public statements regarding the incident been made, and across what channels would they be which channels would they be delivered? Typically what we see is, communication is critical in these types of events, whether it's internally to your employees or externally out to customers or partners. And so having that holding statement ready that's already authorized or can be authorized quickly to be able to push that information out. How is that going to be coordinated? Are you going to bring in a PR firm to help with this information? And are you going to have your outside counsel also reviewing it? There's a lot of concerns, or not a lot of questions on who's ultimately going to sign off on the information or the communications that are going to go out to your partners and to your customers. Are you going to respond on social media? Are you going to put a holding statement up acknowledging that there's an incident? If so, again, who is developing that messaging, and who ultimately signs off within the organization? Typically what we see is, organizations have the ability to create the holding statements or might already have them already in place. But, some of the things that we've seen in our responses, that getting them authorized to be published or to be sent out is, the hindrance in the communications. It gets delayed. It may, someone may be out of the office. There is no backup. The process may not be truly identified. A lot of times we find that in these situations, the organization doesn't know who's going to sign off ultimately on the communications that would go out. What capabilities does the organization have to address social media? And I think it goes into the same thing. Are you able to monitor social media? Are you able to see trends that are popping up regarding the organization's brand, whether more people are starting to talk about customer service or reports of an incident? How are you able to bring that information into the incident response process and share that information? And then how does that drive the outward communications going back out? And would any communication be sent to the organization's customers? And I think, again, it goes back into having all of the types of messaging identified prior to the incident. They may need to be tweaked based on the type of incident, but really understanding who ultimately is signing off on the communications that are going to be going out. What does that look like? Who is their backup? And again, are you going to do this in-house, or are you going to bring in a PR firm to help with that type of messaging in an incident? I think the communication piece is one of the most critical pieces in incident response, especially for anything related to the brand and the customers, and just making sure that everyone understands that what you're doing on the incident. And I think a lot of times that's probably what customers and partners are looking for. that there is an incident, you are working on it, and give them a time when they can expect an update from you. And so I think looking at that pre-incident saves on a lot of stress during the incident and trying to create these communications on the fly.
All right, it's me again. So I just want to quickly say we've got a lot of great questions in the queue. Some of them seem to be a little bit overlapping, so we're going to, some of these we're going to address at the end, and even though they may fit into some of these other parts, I just want to, for those of you who actually haven't responded to questions yet, do not worry. We are noting those, and we'll have some time at the end to go over those. So I want to say it's now, the other thing I want to just say, just following up on Chris's slide a little bit, we often hear this issue with when you talk about your PR, your crisis issue, is that traditionally for a company, the PR team, may or may not work with legal on a variety of different things. There's obviously a number of issues that, obviously cross over. There's, usually, and this is something we often sort through during these tabletops, is the, in terms of crisis communications and making sure all of those communications sort of at least have, run through legal, has someone puts their eye on it. Unfortunately, I know I've had, I know Jen's had, I know others have plenty had, incidents where unfortunately, a company has their PR team puts out a statement which later becomes actionable. So I have a collection of ones where companies have said things such as, we're really sorry this has happened to you. We feel really bad. We could have done a better job. We should have done a better job. We understand how this may impact you, and and that we're very sorry. And there's a whole collection of statements that companies have made in wanting to really be genuine to their customers, to their third parties, to the people whose information and the companies that may have been compromised. But there are ways to say it in ways that you want to be careful of, because we don't want to create a statement that can be then used against you in litigation, even if the company actually wasn't responsible or liable for that. So we always recommend that those communications be vetted. So we're now day 3, Sunday morning, 10 a.m. Your CERT continues their in-depth investigation into the ransomware incident and performs forensics analysis of several impacted hosts. Remember, your CERT is your internal team at this point. Forensics analysis shows the threat actor has been able to exploit a zero-day vulnerability, compromise employee accounts, and move laterally across the company's network. The threat actor's activities have not yet been contained, and CERT is weighing its possible containment options. So the interesting thing here is some people will probably note that, hey, it's Sunday morning, it started on Friday, and we're talking now about, your first question here, should we continue to use CERT to perform the forensic analysis, or should we bring a third party in? This is a great question, and that's followed up with things like litigation. Are we going to, potential litigation from the accident, from the incident? What should we do to preserve? So I will say this, that, again, depending on your incident response plan, we may have already, called in, our external threat, our external forensics provider. We would reach out to them and bring them in to do an analysis. So depending on the nature of the incident, we may know right away that litigation is possible. We may also know that based on the incident that we may want to look into and determine whether or not there are reasons to do the investigation internally or not. So some of the reasons we look to why you'd bring in and when you would bring in your independent third party is you want the people who are in house. There's sometimes a bias, right? Sometimes they know the system. They may be responsible for the problem. We've had plenty of times where the outside managed IT service provider who was the one responsible for failing to implement security protocols, and now is being asked to determine what happened or how did the security incident occur. And so they're very unlikely to say, oh, it was my fault. I did not do something I was supposed to. Sometimes they may, but often it's not. So you want to reduce the risk of potential cover-up. You want the reviewer to be objective and to look at everything to determine whether or not something may or may not have compromised. You want to also make sure you have, there are no assumptions, right? Someone who already knows the systems may assume certain things operate in a certain way or don't operate in a certain way. So you want to make sure you have that independent review. But if you're also in litigation, you have to consider the impact of how, that you had a third-party review as opposed to you had your own people or your service provider perform that risk. Depending on that investigation, you may want to consider whether you need a two-track investigation. That would be considering things like litigation versus the business impact. So the business impact may be things such as what happened, how do you remediate the incident and how do you respond? Versus litigation, you may call, you'll call your outside counsel, you'll look at, bring on forensics, and you'll provide the legal advice on what legal obligations a company may have. What is the legal risk? What will be the litigation response, or what are your obligations in terms of under data breach, laws that may exist. If you have, the other thing is we talk about attorney work product, and the attorney work product doctrine, we're talking about protecting documents that are prepared by or on behalf of attorneys in anticipation of litigation. It would not protect those documents that are in reports that are prepared for other purposes, right? So potentially your business use, right? How does the IT team get together and work and sort of rebuild the network, right? So you also want to discuss, what would go into that forensics report and whether or not you're going to want a written report or an oral report. I would say these are the times you consider it, but you usually may not finalize that decision until later on. So we usually do hold off onto that. And then you also want to consider anytime you're writing a report, even one that's under privilege, is to consider what would happen if that report gets disclosed. What information is being put in there? Does everything you're being put into the report need to be in the report? So you want to consider some of those things. You also want to consider that whether or not you have an obligation or you should pursue additional forensics. What happens? What is the internal team? What have they discovered? Right? Is there something they're looking at that they obviously, whether it's beyond their capability? Do they see anything? Do they not? What's the type of malware that's present? And so those types of things will end up having an impact on whether or not you bring in third-party forensics. There's also, do you have regulatory obligations? Are you obligated to pursue forensics? What are your obligations there? What are your contractual obligations in the event of an incident? Do you have third parties that require you to do so? What's the cost of doing so? Everything does have a cost, and I want to make sure we always want to consider that as well. And then what's the impact? We have this often, and companies going through potentially is being acquired or looking for equity investment, et cetera. And if someone's investing or buying the company and they find that you did not do a investigation when you should have, what's going to be the impact? How are they going to view the company? So we have, and then we do have a polling question. We're gonna, I'm gonna probably say this is I think EY is going to pick up from here. We're gonna switch over, but I'm gonna just read it out, and then I think this was one of theirs. But the question is, after you're at this point, what containment actions would be considered? Password resets, disabling accounts, disabling access to network shares, and then disconnecting network servers. So while that is going in the background, I'll give you all just a few moments to answer that. Let's see if we can get a question or two answered real quick. In terms of, I see, do most companies have cyber insurance? I will say that this, it's increasing. There are a number of companies that do. I will say at this moment, we still have a lot of clients that do not have cyber insurance. And in terms of saying cyber insurance, I say that will vary in terms of what a policy looks like throughout. It can be very different in terms of what they cover, how they cover. And in terms of, we already talked about the provider, that the insurance carriers bring to the table a lot of different resources. But with anything else, all policies should be negotiated by someone who knows what they're doing with respect to insurance. So what that means, you want to bring in, you have your own incident response team. And so I've got, we work with a number of clients. We've built out, fairly extensive incident response plans. So they use those, so if they have named parties, whether it's legal, forensics, payment providers, et cetera, they will use those, and they will discuss with the provider as well that they want them named and endorsed onto their policy. So it all depends, but I'm going to turn it over now. Is that
Sure. And then in terms of containment actions, it looks like, disconnecting network servers, that is a very good idea to isolate the network as soon as you think something is happening to stop the spread. That can be, effective and save further damage. Password resets, that's also very important, especially the actual, remediation phase, containment and remediation. You'll be wanting to, understand what credentials or username and passwords the attackers are using for access in the network. And then there'll be usually multiple password resets, maybe one during the incident, and then once everything is kind of, understood, and then, fully trying to get, up and running again, you'll probably likely do another reset as well. disabling accounts. Companies are shocked at how many privileged accounts, administrative accounts, and then service accounts are in place in environments. Usually way too many. You're supposed to have like least privilege, so the minimum amount of access you need to do your job. But oftentimes, for various reasons, companies will have multiple different service accounts, multiple different admin accounts, and attackers also like to use those and can use those during these types of attacks. And then disabling access to network shares, that can be another kind of containment phase to basically stop the spread of the ransomware, similar to disconnecting network servers. And then going on to the next
Jamie,
slide.
just to kind of add on to there.
Oh, sure.
Jamie, just add on there real quick. A lot of those decisions will be done by the incident commander, right? And he'll take the information that's provided from the extended incident response team, which would be IT and the business units, and really kind of understanding, a lot of times you have to understand the downstream effects of disconnecting some of the servers and, disabling the network shares, and what impact will they ultimately have on the overall business as well. So there's a lot of considerations that go into account. And again, having these discussions prior to an incident really make responding to an incident, more efficient, more effective.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for bringing that up, Chris. So now we're going to switch gears into Monday morning, since it's now day 4, 11 a.m. And we're talking about recovery. This is always a good discussion to talk about. The CCRT team has determined that recovery from backups will take about 1 to 2 days per system, and there are about 10 systems requiring restoration. So if you do the math here, it'll be basically between, best case 10 days, or possibly 15 days is what the team is guessing. This is a pretty mild case for a number of encrypted systems. I've had cases with hundreds of systems encrypted, and you really have to do a lot to benefit from scaling the recovery effort. But anyway, that's the system, or the situation here. So we're saying about 10 to 15 days. That's still a long time for any company to be offline for basically 2 weeks. That's considerable. So that now that you know this information, there are going to be additional considerations on do you pay the ransom, do you not, with this information. So let's bring up some additional questions to consider. So the first one is around, would you consider paying the ransom? And then other things to consider, who will be involved in developing your recovery strategy? There's a lot that goes into recovery. There are, your key applications, key systems. A lot of these systems have different dependencies, and you need to restore them in the right order for them to function correctly. And then you're also going to have different prioritization. There are going to be certain key business systems, applications that you want to restore first, and other things that will be lower priority. Ideally, you've already thought this through and have already mapped the different dependencies and prioritizations. This is really difficult to do in the moment, especially if you no longer have access to your systems. This can be really, really painful to figure out live without any access, or even if your documentation's encrypted, then you're basically going off of memory, which can lead a lot of things to issue. So really important to have your recovery strategy figured out and documented, and also have an offline copy of it. And then what systems will be given priority? I kind of covered that one already, but that's also very important. And then who or what committees within the organization will determine whether to pay the ransom? So we're going to talk about that a little bit more coming up. And actually, that's going to be our next polling question. But before we go in, well, I'll start the polling question and let you, start answering that. So who or what committees within the organization will determine whether to pay the ransom? So with this, the audit committee, the full board of directors, the board chair, the audit committee chair, executive committee, C-suite, anyone with contract signing authority up to the dollar amount of the ransom, CSO, CIO, or counsel. And then while you answer that, I did want to mention just some other considerations, and this one, comes up quite a bit, especially working at Ernst Young being a Big Four auditing company, is, when do you notify your auditor? And, do you inform your auditor? When do you inform your auditor? And this is, something that comes up on, any kind of serious incident. And it should basically come down to, your auditor should be informed as soon as possible if it's something that may impact their financial audit. So like a ransomware incident, I've had a number of cases where the general ledger actually gets encrypted by the ransomware effort. Then you definitely want to inform your auditor, because that directly affects the work that they're doing. And then the auditor is going to ask you a number of questions from that, because they want to know, how did you get comfortable that the data can be relied upon during their audit, and then what procedures you performed to then gain that comfort. And if you think about it, the attacker essentially just accessed and changed the data on your system as part of the encryption. So it's something to really keep in mind. Okay, so just a little bit, just please maybe just answer the question on the screen if you just have another moment or two. Because we have just a little bit more before we get to the final questions. Okay. And here, let's see, we got the full board of directors, CEO, executive committee, C-suite, legal counsel. And the answer to this, it really depends. It depends on the organization. It's normally not one single person. It's usually a group of people. But something as serious as this, there's normally some discussion should definitely take place. I have heard of cases where somebody with a contract signing authority just went ahead and paid it. I wouldn't recommend that approach, but it's definitely something that should be discussed and thought about, because there are a lot of different ramifications that can happen because of any decision if you do move forward with paying the ransom. I think Aaron's going to talk a little bit more on the decision to pay.
Yes, this is Chris. I was going to say, go ahead.
Yeah. Yep. So at this point, the ransom decision has been made, and leadership came back to a decision not to pay the ransom and rebuild servers or recover from backups where applicable. Most systems must be rebuilt as the backups were encrypted during the incident, adding additional time to remediation timeline. CERT begins the eradication and recovery process and the remediation of the compromised accounts. Okay, so we're starting in the remediation portion. This is really an important piece of it, and I know there's two questions in the chat on the side. How do you evaluate backups, right, to make sure that they're not encrypted? One of the things that we recommend is that you have an offline set of backups, and if not, at least have them segregated off from your normal network, so that they're not easily able to be found by the cyber threat hacker or attacker, because they look for them. That's one of the first things that they do. Typically in a ransomware event, they may be in your system. We've seen it up to, and there's no up to date where it's a, exact number, but we've seen them in there for roughly around 45 days, trying to really understand the network, understand the most important systems, the critical systems that they need to really encrypt to have that impact on the organization. And they're looking for the backups, right? And if they can find the backups, they're going to encrypt them and make them so that they're useless, so that you have to pay the ransom. So, understanding where your backups are stored and what that process is, and testing that a lot, right? Testing that you can recover from your backups is really important. There are incidents out there where at least one city that I'm aware of decided not to pay the ransom. However, they had backups, but they had never practiced recovering from the backups. So they were unable to get their systems back up and running. And what, this was in the earlier days, but their ransom was $75,000. I think it ended up costing them over $7 million, because they couldn't get their systems back up and running on there. So testing the backups, knowing where your backups are located are really important. Are you going to bring in a disaster recovery firm to assist in bringing your systems back online? If so, have you thought about who that vendor is? Will you coordinate that, through your general counsel for privilege purposes? How are you going to test the data to make sure that it's has not been changed, right? And so there has to be a lot of coordination on the recovery process between the incident response team, disaster recovery, the business units, right, and IT. And so it really becomes a team sport on the recovery process, validating the data that's there, and making sure that any manual operations that had been running in the early incident timeline is now able to be reconstituted back into the systems once they're up and running. And I know one other question that I'd like to address here in the chat is, how do you make sure that the vulnerability is taken care of before you bring your systems back online? And that's part of the investigation and the root cause analysis, and working with all of these different teams to understand how the incident occurred. What are the indicators of compromise? Maybe from threat intelligence, maybe it's from law enforcement, maybe it's from the incident response team, or even your insurance company from the information they have from prior incidents, or outside counsel. Understanding what that looks like and being able to then fix that issue prior to bringing those systems back up online. You would not want to bring them up without knowing how the attacker got in the first place, and not remediating that. Okay, and then I think couple of the other questions that we want to talk through here is ensuring the integrity, right? And this is really that team process. I think it's the coordination between the business units and IT, understanding the data that's supposed to be there. Is it correct? How do they validate it? And having that process identified for your critical systems prior to the incident will be critical in your recovery. And then how often will the organization's leadership want to be updated? This is another area that establishing this prior will make this response a lot less stressful, because you're going to understand what leadership wants in their updates and how often they want to do it. And then ultimately, right, this should be assigned to a primary and a backup, so that they understand their role during the incident, and they're familiar with what the information is that leadership wants to see, how they want to see it, and where that information is going to come from. So the updates are going to be critical. Having one sort of, I would call it sort of the ledger of truth as to what are the facts of the incident, and that has to be maintained, as we only have one. We can't, you don't, as an organization, want to have people or other parts of the incident response team, extended response team, sending emails out about the facts of the incident. One person should be maintaining that. It should be located, in a centralized location where everyone can see the facts, and updating it is assigned to one person, so that they are able to make sure that those facts are accurate. And if there are any changes, everyone is going off the one set of facts in the response, and understanding and making decisions off of the information that's being provided. Okay. All right.
So in light of time, I'm going to run through the point of this slide. So this is Monday evening at 5 p.m. The issue here is, all the decisions have been made. This is sort of the end. Board of directors want sort of an update. This leads into something we want to get to at the very end, sort of lessons learned, follow-up. The short answer, which I'll show you what the answers were on the next slide, but we're going to sort of skip over the poll. The thing I do want to bring up here, though, in capturing all this information, the important point is really the lessons learned. This is a very often overlooked situation, oftentimes for a lot of reasons, but it is critical to improving an organization's security posture and steady state and readiness to face and respond to an incident. And so the This process, though, is what helps a company sort of evaluate their incident response performance, identify any challenges, and determine how they're going to move forward. In order for it to be effective, you really need sort of 4 parts to your lessons learned. You want to follow a strict process. You want to answer or provide answers to some very specific questions that came up throughout the tabletop. You want to establish some type of clearly defined action plan, and you want to follow up with continuous improvement. And I just want to make a note that according to a NIST special publication 800-61, version 2, comment that came out of that was one of the most important parts of incident response is also the most often omitted, learning and improvement. They found that only 58% of organizations regularly review and update their incident response process as a result of either incidents themselves or tabletops. Obviously, with numbers like that, it makes it very difficult for companies to be prepared and ready to handle incidents. So with that, I was just going to show you, we had some questions here, really was who's responsible. The answer is correct. Janitor, that's the one who cleans up the organization. I'm just kidding. So no one needs to worry about that. Jen?
Sure. I'm just going to quickly go over some statistics, and then we'll give you your final CLE code and leave a few minutes for questions. So at the end of the day, we just wanted you to feel good about yourself today, is that really, testing your IR plan, forming your IR team, and if you look down this list, also involving board members, really goes to saving money. It really goes to the ROI. We highly recommend that you take this home and do tabletops in your organizations, because it really helps cut down on the cost of data breaches. We also want you to be aware that we do have a free data breach notification chart. We put it online. We update it throughout the year. You can always Google it and take a look at it. It gives you an idea of the different requirements throughout the year. We also have the Midwest Cybersecurity Alliance, where we'll be doing sessions on insider threat, also on cyber insurance that are coming up if you're interested in that as well. And then I'm going to jump quickly. We're going to go back to lessons learned, but I wanted a moment for everyone to get the last CLE code in.
Thank you, Jen. At this time, I will announce the second CLE code. For those seeking CLE credit today, please type the following into the box on your screen and hit the submit button. MT27N. M as in the word mountain, T as in the word tough, the number 2, the number 7, the letter N as in Nancy. One more, MT27N. I'll now hand it back over to Jen to close out today's program. Thank you.
We have a few moments here at the end, and what Erin said is incredibly important, is to think about lessons learned that you learned through the tabletop exercise. Be careful how you document that as well. Certain lessons learned may need to be through legal counsel and documented to the file under attorney-client privilege. But in the few minutes, we're happy to stay on the phone for a little bit longer. We can go through some of the questions that were asked. If you want to put any other questions in the Q&A box, we will try to address them now, and thank you so very much.
So I'm going to take a moment just real quick to throw off. So one thing I wanted to comment, as Jen put up that chart, one of the things about these tabletops are they are incredibly low cost process to get a really high ROI. So, Jen mentioned that. It is absolutely true. It is something that will just truly make a real difference for the organization. We cannot highly recommend it enough to go through this exercise. And again, depending on whether or not, what kind of organization you are, what you're subject to, you may need to go through exercises like this on an annual basis, or you may want to consider going through these, these types of things on a regular basis. One of the things in terms of just quickly, and we'll sort of do we'll do some of the questions. I will say, you guys have been great. We've got dozens and dozens of questions in the queue. So we'll go through some of those. We'll sort of do round robin or however we'll do it. So since I'm talking, I guess I will make a few quick comments and pass it around. And I see that, there's still, quite a tremendous number of you still on the phone, so still on the line. So we will stay for a while and answer as many questions as we can get through. So one thing I want to say when we do these tabletops is I cannot stress it enough as well. You want senior management leadership to be a part of this. Oftentimes, these seem, we go into some companies and we get there and we find out it's just, I don't want to say that's any people low down on the totem pole, but there are, it doesn't go all the way up through the organization. And ultimately, these are decisions that have to be made by the people who who really are invested in the organization. If you're talking about paying ransom, you're talking about, allowing data to be, published, PR issues. I mean, it could be, could be personal issues. It could, there are people who have a stake in the company. So, and oftentimes these decisions, by the way, often are required by the plan to be made by, again, senior officers, directors of the company. So we want to make sure that they are involved. Another thing I just want to bring up, it doesn't, it wouldn't come up in this tabletop, but I've done a lot of work with the hospitality industry and restaurants and things like that, where QR codes have been used. I mean, everyone knows every menu has been, in light of COVID, and companies are plastering them all over the place, and not even in the hospitality space. But I will say that we are seeing a very fast-growing threat vector through the use of these QR codes. You want to be very careful. So there are things that you can do, an organization can do, in terms of trying to address the vulnerabilities from these QR codes, which seem quite, they seem quite sort of innocuous, but they can be very malicious. And we see that. In fact, we were at an organization, we did a walkthrough, and we found there were QR codes being posted on stickers around the place, and several of them were absolutely malicious. They opened up, vulnerable, web pages that led to malware. They sent messages to the user without authorization. You've heard about these types of things. So, I want to just bring that up. I mean, there's lots of different things that we can bring here, but I don't want to take it all myself, so I'll pass it on to who's next.
Sure. I just want to make sure we cover one of the questions. Since this is an NDI session, one of the questions was, should the full board participate, in this? Now, it depends on the organization. Typically, full boards don't do the entire session. Many organizations may run multiple tabletops through the years and have senior executives board on some of them, whereas they have full technical focused tabletops outside PR. But typically, we don't see boards sitting in on the entire tabletop exercise. Usually tabletops can run from half day to full day. So I think it really depends on the board's, craving for a tabletop, and maybe it would be a shorter session for the board, or they would come in certain injection points. But if they wanted to participate all day, I would say that would be fabulous as well.
I want to just throw out another quick comment, which is, as Jen just made a great comment about, you may have multiple different groups in or involved with your tabletops. So one of the things that we see as a problem is that when you talk about enterprise-wide, is that if you silo a tabletop, it becomes difficult, because an organization may not know how to work with each other, with cross-function, cross-department, cross-entity. So you want to make sure that you do part of these tabletops, again, enterprise-wide, making sure people know how to work with the people in other groups. But another thing that these tabletops, we see as a miss, and I know we've worked with Chris and Jamie on these types of things as well, is also your vendor supply chain, right? Your vendors as well, and third parties. At the very, you can't imagine that the risk, the vulnerability that the threat that they impose on an organization. You're seeing it now a lot with supply chain issues, et cetera. And so if you don't incorporate your vendors into your tabletops as in terms of as a possibility, or even reaching out to your vendors and saying, hey, can I get a copy of a log, certain logs, in terms of, access to data or system access, if your vendors are connecting with your systems, reaching out to them. Sometimes we do involve vendors in tabletops in limited capacity. Sometimes we use them as the example. Sometimes we actually, we do full threat assessments with vendors. But you also want to make sure it's not just insular, looking inwards, and you also look outwards to all of your various threat vulnerabilities in effect. We've got lots of other questions. I don't know if Chris or Jamie, you've got any lessons learned you want to, at this time, if we can also answer some of the questions here, because we've still got pretty much everyone still online and hungry for those questions.
No, just one quick one, Aaron. I think, how often should you have them? We definitely recommend at least yearly. We're seeing more organizations, increase that to biannually or even quarterly. It really depends on your organization and the maturity level within the incident response process. And we do a lot of different tabletops from different teams, right? It might be just singular, like a technical type of tabletop exercise for the incident response team. We might do a more executive level that includes the extended, right, or even the members of the board who observe as well. And then there's sometimes we'll do a much shorter board exercise It's really more about having the discussion around the decisions that will be coming to them when there is an incident. Those are typically much shorter, maybe like an hour and a half or so to 2 hours at the most, but just something to consider.
And then one thing to add. Sorry. Sorry. Someone else can go.
Sorry, Jamie, I think you had a good comment there. There's something with your mic, but, one of the other typical questions that we get is, what should we do now that we have an incident response plan? A lot of the work that we're doing for clients now is reviewing their incident response plan, keeping in mind that, post-breach, many plaintiffs' firms or others will hold you to the standard of what's in your incident response plan. So we're really taking those secondary looks saying, would you really actually follow this? Is it a good practical document? We're doing a lot of work also trying to align the IR plan upwards towards your crisis communication plan. Many C-suites are trained on one crisis management plan. And so your IR plan should have similarities. And how does it work in conjunction with your crisis management plan? We're also doing a lot of training for boards and C-suite around ransomware and really who makes those decisions to pay and who has signatory authority to do that. Because again, all of us in the corporate world, thank goodness for all of these years, we're typically not used to dealing with cyber criminals and threat actors. And so it's a new thing to practice with boards. So I think that is the biggest takeaway is that, and somebody asked, do you have sample response plans? We do. We have model response plans. I will say it's one of those things that they're very customizable to an organization, meaning many organizations have different players and a different feel for their IR plan. But yes, happy to help you all in any sort of ways. This is what we do day in and day out.
And let me... Jamie's back. Look at that. Okay, go for it.
Sorry, I think my audio is fixed now. One other thing to add to that is, in addition to, running mock incidents, IR plan, actually having a specific ransomware playbook that's, just specifically on ransomware. And then other things that we'll do with companies, we'll actually run a simulated attack. So we'll actually work with our penetration testing team and work on testing your company's detection capabilities, making adjustments to improve some of the most common ways that these ransomware groups will target your company and some of their tools and make sure you're actually able to either prevent or detect those types of attacks. And then looking at your backup strategy, and also do like a ransomware readiness assessment where looking at how your backups are stored and protected because when things go south, that's the first thing you want to be able to use in the backups. Attackers do, target those because they try to inflict as much harm as possible. So they either encrypt them or delete them. And if you can prevent that from happening, you'll be, in much better shape.
So I want to throw out, we've got a number of questions all related to issues going back to during the ransomware issue. So a couple of things, I'll sort of group them together, a couple of these questions. One of them is that when you do start to engage with them, one of the things I do, as I mentioned, sort of pause the clock. It does, just because you start talking with them does not mean that you're going to pay. That allows you time to sort of vet through to see, hey, is this the actual threat actor? Is this legitimate? Do they have data? Do they actually have, sometimes they actually may give you a proof of concept or a sort of proof of life, show you data, but it turns out they may have gotten that may all that they have, right? There are ways to determine whether or not they actually have, that which you have, or the fact that they just gave you everything that they had. But it's also the fact that you can, again, you put them on hold for a while. It allows you to have discussions with them. I will say pretty much all ransom in terms of amounts, if you're having that discussion with them, everything is negotiable because at the end of the day, someone who's asking you for millions of dollars, if you give them a couple million versus multi-millions or tens, at the end of the day, they're happy to get that money. Don't get me wrong. I mean, everyone wants as much as they can. But for those of you who've actually seen some of the raids, so some of these are caught, these are folks that, are driving, cars, they have multi-million-dollar car collections and house collections. They got bars of gold. I mean, these people are living, quite luxurious in their lives in private jets and everything else going on. But at the end of the day, that, getting $1 million, getting a couple million or whatever it may be, even a couple $100,000, is still money to them. However, be very careful that sometimes your greed, if you are thinking you're going to pay and you want to try and negotiate the best deal possible, two things can happen. One is it turns out you over-negotiate, and they end up saying, you know what, it's worth more for us to now publish your name and your data than it is for the meager amount of dollars that you're willing to pay. So always consider there's got to, you need, and that's where, again, experienced negotiators, folks like us here at Foley, stuff like at Ernst Young, we see a lot of this. We kind of have an idea of, what the numbers are for each group. The other thing, though, that if the number isn't enough, and we've seen this unfortunately, and when it happens to you, it's awful, is that they take the money and then they come back and say, you know what, it wasn't enough. Or a lot of these are sort of, marketing affiliates. And so they have to pay the actual creator, the sort of, the gang leader, if you want to call it, the organization. And so if they don't have enough money to pay, they may come back or they'll send somebody else to pay to get money from you because they need, there's a certain amount of money that has to be paid up the chain. So you always want to be careful that sometimes the best deal is not the best deal. And so that's something you always want to consider. That being said, if you decide you are going to pay and you do pay, again, based upon sort of, again, advice of, this collective that's advising you and telling you whether or not these people seem to be legit, is that it's a business at the end of the day. And for the most part, that, as I say, we all talk about the honor amongst thieves. And we know that if you pay and they provide you the decryptor key and leave you alone, that they can continue on to harass the next person. But if they're found out the first time, whether it's one of the forensics companies, the negotiators, us, law enforcement, the first time we find out that they don't honor that deal, we let everybody know. And guess what happens? They're never going to collect again because you're not going to want to pay somebody if you're going to have your data exposed and your name out there. So, so there is some of that. But again, it's not just because you're paying that they're going to do it. There's a little bit more diligence that has to go involved in that. So I try to answer a bunch of those questions all grouped together. I'll let someone else. We still have everyone still on the line, which is great. So we're going to continue answering some questions. Who wants to take the next group?
Aaron, I think just one quick piece to add on to what you had said there. Even if you pay the ransom and receive the key, typically it's keys, and it's usually a key per device, right, or instance, which could really you need to have a whole process in place to be able to match that key to which computer, which server it is actually decrypting, and sometimes a lot of the keys will not function, and a back and forth with the ransomware actor has to keep going to try to get the right key for the right system. So it's a huge process in decrypting, even when you pay the ransom. It's not that like you had mentioned earlier where you flip the switch and okay, we're going to be back up in a few hours. That is a long process still to take those keys, get them to decrypt, and then you still have the rest of the remediation process of fixing the vulnerability and everything else that goes along with that remediation, verifying the data and everything else, getting it back up to make sure that you're ready to go back live again. So it's definitely a very cumbersome process.
Yep, and one thing to add, I guess two things to add. It's really important to do a thorough investigation, so you understand exactly when did the attackers get in, what did they touch, what types of persistence mechanisms did they put in your network, and because then you need to go through and like what Chris said is you need to go through and kind of harden your defenses and improve the areas what the attackers took advantage of. Otherwise, you might be susceptible to another attack. And we have seen companies get hit more than once. So they might get hit once by one group, and then either they didn't pay the ransom, now the attacker's upset, they get back in and encrypt data, or the attacker gets paid, they go off on their own way, and then another attacker comes in, weeks or months later. We've seen it happen before. So it's, just because you've been hit once doesn't mean you won't be hit again.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Jamie. I mean, back again, we have a lot of board of directors. This is because it's our NDI session. Going back to the board, I think all boards really need to sit down and think about, from a strategic perspective, how they want to be involved in decision-making regarding ransom. Would that be the full board? Would it be the chair of the audit committee? Would it be the audit committee? What are, the financial controls that are in place? Who needs to have signatory authority? If in fact ransom is paid, how do we report that out? I think that is one of the biggest things is really to have a discussion with the board to the level of oversight and involvement they want to have in the process. Clearly with ransomware, and if it's it's a attack that is shutting down systems, the board is obviously going to be involved and get updates. But unfortunately, when ransomware payment decisions need to be made, you may not be able to reach your entire board. So I think it's really a discussion amongst the board members to get a meeting of the minds about their level of involvement, and who that would be delegated to.
I think it's a great point. So throwing out, got a couple more questions. There's a couple that seem to be related, going back to. And by the way, seeing that we still have everybody on here and we still have questions coming in, I mean, this is terrific as far as we're concerned. So we're happy to, again, stay here and answer some more questions. And as I said, you're still putting more in, so that's good. But I want to say that, so in terms of you've gone through this process, you've paid, and Jamie brought up a great point, so just want to hit that one home as well as it connects, is that, one of the risks, obviously, once you pay, is the fact that, you'll be on a list somewhere of people that have paid, and that could also expose you as well in terms of, a threat actor. A different one could say, look, this company has paid. Maybe they'll pay again, and maybe now we know how much they paid, so we kind of have a threshold of what their tolerance is. So that's a risk we always want to consider, but that should also go into, we talk about, sort of, does the company have a policy about, in terms of ransomware? Is this a go, no-go decision? Is it that the company will never pay? And we've had companies like that who are, where the policy tells them what, that they're not going to pay. And no matter what happens, and even if the company is going to go dark for a while, they're not going to pay. Others will say we'll pay, and some of them put thresholds in there, and they do that, cost analysis. But the other question is that, once you've gotten, whether you're clean, we talk about you're getting your decryptor, you're getting, we talk about cleaning up and backups. So you need to, one thing you need to do, and again, this is where, we rely heavily on the folks like, Chris and Jamie and others to come in and make sure that when you're restoring from backup, whether or from a decryptor, remember there is malware there. You need to go through and you need to make sure things are clean. Sometimes we talk about, you got to clean the metal. Sometimes we talk about, you're unable to clean the metal. So sometimes it means buying new equipment. Sometimes it means you can clean it. It depends on what type of malware we're talking about. But before you bring anything back live, you've got to go through and make sure that malware is gone. And backups, you want to make sure something isn't hidden. Unfortunately, I had a company who happened to them 3 times in a row as they restored from backup. All of a sudden, the malware, once it was back out in the network, it re-exploded. And they were down right, all over again. So you want to make sure you go through, and as part of your plan, you clean, you make sure it's clean. You go through, you test. And then also with that data, you go back and you test the integrity of your data, because you do not want your business, especially data that has either been restored from backup. There may be gaps. But also, if you do it with a decryptor key, again, as I said, it's destructive encryption. And so when you restore, you want to make sure, what are you relying upon? Is that data something you can use? Is the integrity of it sufficient? Are you able to clean it up, repair it? And what if it's on your financial systems? And then again, we call up Jamie and Chris. We say, we need to talk to one of your colleagues in auditing, and we need to talk about, can we rely upon this data for, a public company making, their financial disclosures? So these are things we work with our client, colleagues here at Foley, and in our compliance, our SEC practice, and our in our corporate group and our securities group, to make sure these are questions. I mean, it's not just Jen and I on a call or on a matter. We have there's other members at Foley here, whether it's insurance, corporate securities, litigation, et cetera, involved in terms of making a response, depending on, again, based upon the incident itself. So you always want to make sure that you clean. And as part of your tabletop, we talk about, we would have a slide in here talking about, all of a sudden you find out, we may have a slide that says your backups are clean, they're missing, they're gone, you found malware on them. So it's like a choose your own adventure to base, again, what you're trying to achieve in that particular tabletop. But these things do happen in real life. And so, we always talk about, when you're doing your risk assessment, looking at backups and making sure, how do you know that they're going to be secure in the event of an incident is critical, because that will have a major recovery impact on your recovery. All right.
I see there's a comment on what about nonprofit boards, and nonprofits ransomware groups will go after nonprofits. They go after hospitals. I mean, these guys are ruthless, and it kind of goes down to your ability to pay and willingness to pay. That's what they care about. But I mean, several hospital systems have been hit by these groups and have had really devastating effects. So I'm not quite sure if I got the spirit behind that question, but in terms of who they target nonprofits, I mean, they're also in the crosshairs sometimes. And then there's another question about percentage of clients being prepared. It's hard to give I don't want to give a straight percentage, but I have a number of success stories where the clients were able to restore from backups. It may have taken them a bit longer than they had hoped, but they did at least have backups that they were able to restore from and not pay that ransom. I've had clients that for various other reasons that they did pay the ransom, whether that was cyber insurance or other elements involved that led them down that path. But I do have some success stories that the clients were able to restore from backup, and it was still very costly for them. They paid more than that ransom in their recovery efforts, but they already had to do that no matter what. There's kind of a long tail to this where the actual recovery and then the improvement that needs to take place as part of cleaning up from these events is usually pretty significant. But these events highlight oftentimes the kind of technical and security debt that companies have kind of accumulated, and needed change that has to take place to get them in better shape security-wise.
I think that's a really good point. I mean, one thing that I want to emphasize is where do you go from here? I would say the typical things that we all do on the phone are looking at your incident response plan, making sure it aligns with your cyber insurance policy. One of our partners here, in particular, Ethan Lenz, is helpful to go through your policy with you, figure out those nuances, making sure all your vendors are on there. We update and review IR plans all the time, thinking about ransomware. We all help with tabletop exercises. We have litigators here as well to help with strategies. We do data mapping exercises. A lot of these things around tabletop exercises depend on where you are in the world. There are certain notification deadlines that are 72 hours, not to individuals, fortunately, but to regulators. So I really think that, the next step is going back to your organization and making sure you have these things in place. I mean, the U.S. government has set warnings out to private companies saying you need to be prepared. And there are several memos from the White House that set forth basic security requirements. And, really in the world of the legal world, what that says is that best practices are certainly out there. And at a minimum, you should be doing certain things to protect your systems. Many of them we talked about here on the call today. We're happy to do any sort of follow-ups. But I guess I would say no longer is the day to say, we're just a victim from ransomware, which we all can be. It's also about trying to prepare that preventative strategy that if it does happen to you, and unfortunately it happens to a lot of companies, that you're able to have a very cohesive story to regulators, to plaintiffs' attorneys, to customers and others about that you were a very good actor. You did take this very seriously. Your board addressed these issues. You put monies into, trying to have best security practices, following frameworks, et cetera. And so in other words, what we're trying to say is, you do need to come up with your overall cybersecurity strategy, because that is what you are judged on post-breach, even when, unfortunately, you are a victim to these threat actors that are getting worse and worse as the years go.
So one of the questions, I guess there's two variations or three variations of the question in terms of actual, any other actual lessons learned or things like that. And so I think somebody else had a comment. But one thing, going through these tabletops and actually actual incidents, what we've learned is a couple of things that do come up. There's obviously there's something unique always, but a lot of the threats that we're seeing that companies get taken down for aren't new, right? A lot of them are things that have existed for 10 plus years. Companies are well, but they may not have known. Or they may not have been patching properly or anything else, but we're seeing there absolutely are certain zero-day vulnerabilities, vulnerabilities that no one who is responsible for ensuring that, a risk being mitigated, they were not aware of them, or the vulnerability was there, but there was no known patch for, et cetera, so no way to defend against. But let's take that off the table for a moment. We see a tremendous number of incidents that are caused by vulnerabilities that companies were well on notice for. And so going through these risk assessments, going through these tabletops is an incredible exercise in terms of getting through that and understanding that and helping companies better prepare. We're also seeing that even companies that went through a tabletop and were successful through the tabletop exercise or successful after an incident, it may have been that that incident sort of attacked one particular vulnerability, but the company may have still been vulnerable, or I said they may have tried one exploit that the company was protected against, but they may have had other vulnerabilities that weren't addressed. And we're seeing this. We'll do a risk assessment of a company, and we'll find out that there were other exposures. And so just because you survived one, you had a successful tabletop or survived one attack, doesn't mean you're going to be successful against the next one. And even if you were, theoretically, don't forget, again, new exploits happen all the time. So you may be protected today, but not tomorrow. The number of incidents that we go to and we find out that they don't have data backups, forgetting the ones who had their backups compromised, in terms of not even having backups, is actually, to this day and age, is actually rather surprising. We're seeing that quite a bit. And going through this incident response plan, I mean, there was on this slide in terms of having your incident response plan being critical in terms of getting through and surviving, and as well as not only in the initial detection of the breach, going through the breach, the remediation and recovery, and then lessons learned, obviously, but going through all that companies who don't have a proper incident response plan or don't follow them. And look, and I get it. There are lots of times where a company may have a great plan in place, but people end up frantic, right? And they don't have their data breach coach, but it could be someone internally or externally. I know Jen and I, Chris and Jamie, and all have served as data breach coaches. We drop in to a client. We sort of we take the helm and help a client through in a calm sort of manner, as having done this a number of times. We walk through and make sure that the incident response plan is followed. But if you skip those steps, if you do it in the wrong order, or you fail to do it, and as Jen mentioned, if you fail to follow your incident response plan, that in itself can have additional liability outside of the actual liability you would have if you had followed it. And then just finally is that the number of companies, it's thankfully a smaller group, but I will say companies that believe that if they paid the ransom and they get, I always love is that the threat actor will say, oh, and if you pay, I will tell you how I exploited your environment. I will tell you, I will give you a free risk assessment of your, and it's the most, garbage BS thing I've seen. But the point is that they rely upon that sort of bargain that they say that they've got the, that they've got the, they made the payment, they got the deal, and they say, okay, we're no longer vulnerable. And I will tell you that is, that's the time where you need to gear up and make sure you've covered your tracks, make sure that, because everyone now, I shouldn't say everyone, but those on the dark web will know that you have vulnerabilities. Third parties will know. If you're in the media, you have a few statements, it's going to be out there in the public, so people will know, and you'll be a target. And so that you need to really double down and make sure that you clean up the environment. I will say this again, you guys are fantastic. I cannot believe that we still have. I think actually. Apparently, we still have everybody yet again. I don't know how that's possible. You guys are fantastic. We still have lots and lots of questions, but we are now, we're now at the 2-hour mark. Unless, we could certainly stay here all day, but I do think it would be polite to let you all go back to your desk. But we are around. You have, as you see the slide up on here, is our contact information. We're going to send a follow-up with some additional information, some additional content as well, and we will do our best to answer all those questions we were unable to get to in this presentation. I don't know if there's any closing remarks that need to be said in terms of closing out the presentation, but I'm going to pause there.